logical reason.
Yes.
So we'll do one thing. I'll quickly go through the from the beginning because it's not very clear where we stop, but we'll do that. Okay, so I'm beginning to read. Okay, so page 381 of CWSA. This is the difficulty of the logical reason. So should we start?
Yes.
Okay. This is a difficulty of the logical reason and must be met by larger and more Catholic enlightening reason. Logic is very, very valid at our level, but it is not valid at the higher levels. Okay? You have to replace it by something else. Or if it is a difficulty of spiritual experience, it can only be met by wider resolving experience. Even if there's a difficulty in the spiritual experience also, because when you go to the self, the first level of the spiritual planes of consciousness, you see the physical world as unreal very often. Okay? So if it's that, then that's a difficulty, because how can the world which was so real to you suddenly become unreal? So you have to go to a superior spiritual experience. So just as in the world there are different instruments, okay, a farmer can use a spade, he can use bullocks, but he can also use a tractor. There are better instruments. Similarly, the logic also, mind also can use uh, logic at the lower level, but it has to enlarge and become, remove the difficulties of the logical reason, the limitations, and go to the higher. Same thing applies for the spiritual planes of consciousness also. When you are having one aspect of the divine, that's fine, but that's not the only aspect. So you have to go by a higher spiritual experience. Okay, so, or if it's a difficulty of spiritual experience, it can only be met by a wider resolving experience. It has to resolve the problem of the spiritual plane of consciousness also. It can indeed be met also by a dialectical battle. Dialectical battle is argument. Okay, dialectics is saying one thing and then contradicting other, and with a battle, with a logical battle, with a debate, you can go to the next level. Logomachy of the logical mind. I think we discussed the logomachy also the other day. Um, you see, I have the other book now, but Logomachy of the Logical Mind. It's a battle, okay? Dialectical battle. But that by itself is an artificial method. Spiritual experience is the real method. Simply by argument is an artificial method, because you may solve the problem temporarily at the mental level, but it doesn't solve the real problem. Often, a futile combat in the clouds and always inconclusive. What's he discussing? When the finite and the infinite, okay? The finite and the infinite are things which are compatible with each other, but very difficult to understand by the mind. So that's what he's discussing. The eternal and the individual, the problem cannot be solved at the mental level, but you have to be very, very wide-minded to be able to, okay, I don't understand, but I accept. You have to go in that way. Logical reasoning is useful and indispensable in its own field in order to give the mind a certain clearness, precision, and subtlety in dealing with its own ideas and word symbols, so that our perception of the truths which we arrive at by observation and experience, or which physically, psychologically, or spiritually we have seen, may be as little as possible obscured by the confusions of our average human intelligence, its proneness to take appearance for fact, its haste to be misled by partial truths, its exaggerated conclusions. This is a problem always. When there is a truth, if you exaggerate the truth, it becomes falsehood. Okay? Very simple. You should always tell the truth. That's good. It's a truth. But if you take it to the extreme limit, it becomes an untruth, because you don't tell the truth always in all circumstances. Okay. So you also, for instance, you should not murder anybody. That's fine. But if you make that an absolute rule, then there is difficulty. then you can't kill your enemy also. Okay. So it's intellectual and emotional partialities, it's incompetent bunglings in that linking of truth to truth by which alone we can arrive at a complete knowledge. I think we discussed this truth of truth. One truth can be contradicted by another truth. Okay. Very many examples are there in the physical world because there are dualities. Okay. Discipline and freedom, for instance, only one instance I am giving you. Discipline and both are important, but discipline and freedom are opposites. Discipline means you have to obey certain laws that bind you down. Okay? In any organization, there are rules, and you have to abide by the rules. But that's not freedom. So there is both are valid, but there. So at the mental level, these dualities are always a problem. Okay, so they can never be solved at the mental level. The dualities. So he's saying truth by truth. So one is positive truth, and the other is the negative truth. Okay, so you have to link them and go to one level higher and see that both are valid. So, by which alone we can arrive at a complete knowledge. We must have a clear, pure, subtle, and flexible mind, not a mind which is rigid, okay, in order that we may fall as little as possible into the ordinary mental habit of our kind. Our kind means a normal human being, which turns truth itself into a purveyor of errors. Truth itself can become falsehood if you exaggerate it too much. And a purveyor also, we discussed the word, one who supplies, okay, usually supply of food articles. Okay. So truth can become a supplier of errors if you exaggerate it beyond a certain point. That is in the mental level. Even in the spiritual level also, that is also valid, because there are so many who go to the higher mind and say that only the impersonal divine exists, and the personal divine is an invention of the mind. There is no such thing as God. That also in the spiritual plane also there are truth can be a purveyor of errors. That clarification, the habit of clear logical reasoning, culminating in the method of metaphysical dialectics, arguments, okay, for, pro, and con. Metaphysical argument. Metaphysical, philosophical dialectics does help to accomplish, and its part in the preparation of knowledge is therefore very great. The logical thinking is very great in its own field, because very often most human beings, in synthesis very clearly, most human beings are not at a mental level. They are at a vital mental level. So you must have a clear idea and a clear mind. Sometimes the confusion can be so much that one can be surprised. Okay, so. But by itself, it cannot arrive either at the knowledge of the world or of the knowledge of God. Neither knowledge of the world, science. Can science arrive at absolute reality and absolute knowledge of the world? No, because it goes on, making theories and going on, improving its knowledge. It gets more and more knowledge all the time. Or even of God. Okay, that also is not possible. Mind can't. Okay, consciousness can, but mind can't. Much less reconcile the lower and the higher realization. The lower realization and the higher realization is exactly what Sri Aurobindo wants. He wants you to know the higher, which is the divine realization, but he also wants you to know the truth of the physical world. Don't reject the physical world. It is much more efficiently a guardian against error than a discoverer of truth. What is the it? Logic, mental knowledge. Okay, it is much more efficiently a guardian against error. You can use your logic to remove error to a certain extent. It can't discover the truth, but it can remove error. Although by deduction from knowledge already acquired, it may happen upon new truths and indicate them for experience or for the higher and larger truth-seeing faculties to confirm. So he's saying, logically also if you go, you are likely to open up new areas of knowledge. Okay? So as you are going, you open up. That's exactly what's happening in science also and in spirituality also. When in science, for instance, you were concentrating on the cosmic level. Now suddenly you have started concentrating on the microcosmic level. Okay, a whole branch of knowledge has opened up, which is called the nanotechnology. The infinitesimal has got as much power as the microcosm. Okay, the microcosm is as powerful as the. So that's what it's saying. So you have to. It may happen upon you. Logic, when you go by logic, you are. If you think clearly, it opens up new areas, okay, and indicate them for experience or for higher and larger truth-seeing faculties. Truth-seeing faculties, he has used the interesting word, larger truth-seeing faculties. He means faculties which are beyond the senses. He uses the words extrasensorial perceptions, okay? ESP. That's what he means by you see the truth. You don't think the truth, you see the truth. Thinking is replaced by sight. Okay? In the higher mind, sight becomes an instrument of knowledge. In the more subtle field of synthetical or unifying knowledge, the logical habit of mind may even become a stumbling block by the very faculty which gives it its peculiar use. I remember um, Amal Kiran was so logical and so intelligent, but he had an opening in the psychic being. There was a his mental was so developed that it used to be a little rigid. There are many things he used to write, which is very different. For instance, I'll just give you one instance. There is a uh, there is Yasmin, who was very close to Amal. So was I in a certain sense. But for instance, he insisted when the problem in Auroville came up, okay, he insisted that Sri Aurobindo's followers were they formed a religion. Okay, he insisted on that. He said that that's the line to take for the Supreme Court argument. Okay, so absolutely the opposite of what should be said. Sri Aurobindo's philosophy and participants are not religious. It's so clear. Mother has repeated so many times that we are not a religion. Okay, but a person like Amal Kiran also fell into that trap because of the mind. Okay, stumbling block it can become. That's what Shraddha is saying. By the very faculty which gives it its peculiar use, the very advantages of logic can limit you. For it is so accustomed to making distinctions and dwelling upon distinctions and working by distinctions that it is always a little at sea when distinctions have to be overridden and overpassed. Our object then, our object in the integral yoga, okay, in the integral philosophy, not others. Our object then, in considering the difficulties of the normal mind, when face to face with the experience of cosmic and transcendental unity by the individual, look at that, there are three levels. There is the transcendental, there is the cosmic, and there is the individual, and they are all usually experienced quite separately, not all together. All together is possible only at the supramental level. So that's what he's saying. When we are face to face with this problem of the cosmic experience, the transcendental experience, and the individual experience, must be solely to make more clear to ourselves what? First, the origin of the difficulties and the escape from them, and by that, what is more important, the real nature of the unity at which we arrive, and at the culmination of the individual when he becomes one with all creatures and dwells in the oneness of the eternal. So we have to go beyond the mind to get the ultimate truth. So we have to be very clear about the advantages and the disadvantages of the mental logic. That's what he said. Now we will tell you one by one what the difficulties of the mind are. So we can go to the next para. The first difficulty of the reason. I think he will give you, elsewhere also he has done that. He has given three difficulties of the reason and the mistake that it makes.
You have read this para.
The first difficulty also we have read?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll quickly go through it and then we'll see whether it is, and then we'll go on to the next. But in the end, okay, so the first difficulty for the reason is that it has always been accustomed to identify the individual self with the ego. Now, that's what we have to understand. Okay, the ego and the individual self. We feel that we are the body, mind, life. Now that's a big mistake we make. We are not the body, mind, life. This is even after we have the mental knowledge, we constantly make that mistake. We are the soul, and the soul is the consciousness, the divine consciousness in you. That is the real individual. And the difference between that and you are not the grain of salt. You are the saltiness. Okay, I like to use that image because it's very graphic. Okay, your saltiness can be infinite, but the grain of salt cannot be infinite. Okay? It's essentially the same, but one is a limitation and the other is a infinite manifestation of that same thing. Now note, what is interesting is that although one individual's saltiness, individuality is the same essentially as that of another, yet there is a difference. Each soul has got a particular work to be done and it is different. Its nature in the physical world will be different. We come back to that famous of the individual, the Swadharma and Swabhava. Okay, all souls are created by the divine. Essentially, they are divine, but it is not a uniformity. It's a unity of different levels. There is a big difference between unity and uniformity. Uniformity, everybody is wearing the same clothes and everybody's divine nature is the same. No, it is not like that. Okay, it's a harmony, but like the orchestra, 100 instruments all playing different things, yet there is perfect harmony. So, in a supramental race, each one will be expressing a different aspect of the truth, but there will be no clash. There will be total harmony. So that's what I'm saying. The first difficulty for the reason is that it has always been accustomed to identify the individual self with the ego. Okay? There is a difference between the ego and the individual self. And to think of it as existing only by the limitations and exclusiveness of the ego. If that were so, then by the transcendence of the ego, the individual would abolish his own existence. This is the problem in the Buddhistic theory. Okay, not Buddha, but Buddhistic theory. They say that when you go to the higher level of consciousness, ego disappears, but they go to the extreme level of saying your individuality also disappears. But that's not absolutely true. Okay? Your individuality can be maintained, but the individuality has become infinite. Okay? That is, again, we come back to the image of the grain of salt and saltiness. Okay? The individual becomes universal, but he continues to exist. He need not disappear into the infinite non-existence. That's what Sridhar is saying. Because he's saying, if that were so, then by the transcendence of the ego, the individual will abolish his own existence. Our end would be to disappear and dissolve into some universality of matter, of life, of mind, or spirit, or else some indeterminate from which our egoistic determinations of individuality have started. We are starting from the infinite, which breaks itself up into the minute forms, like the white light that breaks itself up into infinite number of colors coming through the prism. So the white light is the total. The green light, the blue light, the violet light, the red light are individual formations of that. But you have to go back to the white light for understanding the reality of things. Okay, so if that were so, by the transcendence of the ego, this is a Buddhistic solution. But Sri Aurobindo says something very interesting. He says that the problem of suffering in the physical world, you don't solve the problem in the physical world. The problem is dissolved for you because the individual also disappears. There is no individual, no suffering, nothing at all. So, operation successful, patient himself is dead. Okay, that is a Buddhistic solution. But the patient should not die. He should be free and free of suffering. So, we go to the next sentence. But what is this strongly separated self-experience that we call ego? Now we will tell you what the ego is. It is nothing fundamentally real in itself, but only a practical construction of our consciousness devised to centralize the activities of nature in us. If the ego is not there in you, you will be like a leaf in the wind. The wind will be pushing you here and there, and you will have no will of your own, you will have no personality, you will have no, you will not be able to withstand the pressures of the world, you will be floating. So the ego is very necessary. So the nature creates an ego for you to centralize your actions in the physical world. Yes, actions and your emotions and your thoughts. They centralize them. Make it limited only to your own body, mind, life. That's a necessity. So you could think of the ego, which is a shadow of the individuality. Okay? The shadow disappears, but the individuality does not disappear when you go to the spiritual planes of consciousness. And so but what is this strongly separated self-experience that we call ego? It is nothing fundamentally real in itself, but only a practical construction of our consciousness devised to centralize the activities of nature in us. So can we say that the shadow is a reality? But when the shadow disappears, then we say, "Arey, this is not nothing permanently real. It is impermanently real." Therefore, there is a gradation of reality also. There are grades of reality. As you keep climbing in consciousness, the reality starts changing its character. What you think is real at one level is not so real as you think in another level. Okay, there are grades of reality. There is a relative reality and an absolute reality. This is what Shankara says, and that's why Sri Aurobindo gives him very high praise. He says that at the intellectual level, the formulation of truth by Shankara is fantastic. Okay, so he says, so ego is that which helps you to centralize yourself. Otherwise, you will be, as I said, a leaf in the wind, okay, without personality, without a will, without an action, and without any strong individuality. There will be no individuality if ego and individual are the same. We perceive a formation of mental, physical, vital experiences which distinguishes itself from the rest of being. My emotion is quite different from your emotion. My body is quite different from your body. This is possible because you have the ego. Okay? If the ego is not there, then there is no the action in the physical world is not significant and not purposeful. We perceive the formation of mental, physical, vital experience which distinguishes itself from the rest of being, and that is what we think of as ourselves in nature. This individualization of being in becoming. What he means by this is the body, mind, life. This individualization of being in becoming. Being is the static, becoming is the physical world. So that which is static breaks itself up into the and becoming in the physical world. The static and a movement. In the movement, body, mind, life exists in the movement, and you identify yourself with that, thinking that it is permanent. It's not permanent. We then proceed to conceive of ourselves as something which has thus individualized itself and only exists so long as it is individualized. A temporary or at least a temporal becoming. A temporary or at least a temporal becoming. Now, he's used two words, temporary and temporal. So, temporary means that which comes into existence and disappears. Okay? And temporal means subject to time. It need not disappear, but it can exist in time eternally, like the universe. The universe is in time but does not disappear. So that's the difference. See how accurate Sri Aurobindo uses the words. Huh? A temporary, that which is there today and tomorrow it is not there. You make a temporary decision, but you can't make a final decision. Today it is valid, tomorrow it won't be valid. Temporary. Temporal, subject to time, but not necessarily fleeting. It can be permanent in time, like the universe. Okay? Temporal becoming. Or else we conceive of ourselves as someone who supports or causes the individualization, an immortal being perhaps, but limited by its individuality. That's another possibility that we can experience. Or else we conceive of ourselves as someone who supports or causes the individualization. Okay. That means to say that there is a connection. An immortal being perhaps, but limited by its individuality. This perception and this conception constitute our ego sense. Normally, we go no farther in our knowledge of our individual existence. So long as you are in the physical world and you are identified with your body, mind, life, your individuality is really the ego, not the individuality. Because you are not conscious of your soul. That's what he's saying. Okay? So, now we can go to the next one.
Shall I read?
Yes, please. But in the end.
But in the end, we have to see that our individualization is only a superficial formation, a practical selection and limited rejecting delight and various joy of union in the nature. Misplaced. Sorry, I'll read it. But in the end, we have to see that our individualization is only a superficial formation, a practical selection, and limited conscious synthesis for the temporary utility of life in a particular body, or else it is a constantly changing and developing synthesis pursued through successive lives in successive bodies. Behind it, there is a consciousness, a Purusha, who is not determined or limited by his individualization or by this synthesis, but on the contrary determines, supports, and yet exceeds it. That which he selects from in order to construct this synthesis is his total experience of the world being. Therefore, our individualization exists by virtue of the world being, but also by virtue of a consciousness which uses the world being for experience of its possibilities of individuality. These two powers, person and his world material, are both necessary for our present experience of individuality. If the Purusha, with his individualizing synthesis of consciousness, were to disappear, to merge, to annul himself in any way, our constructed individuality would cease because the reality that supported it would no longer be in presence. If on the other hand, the world being were to dissolve, merge, disappear, then also our individualization would cease, for the material of experience by which it effectuates itself would be wanting. We have then to recognize these two terms of our existence, a world being and an individualizing consciousness, which is the cause of all our self-experience and world experience.
Basically, I'll give you an image of what he's saying, and then we will discuss the paragraph. Okay, these are synthesis also. He is saying that the river cannot exist without the glacier. Okay, the glacier is something fixed, and it's a solid block of ice which goes on supplying and runs into many rivers. So the river is the ego individuality, but the real individuality is the glacier on top. Okay? Or you can think of the sea and the waves. The real individuality is the deep ocean. The waves on the surface are nothing but your body, mind, life, individuality, which you think to be your individuality. But remember, the wave is being born and it dies, but the ocean does not die. So the ocean is your real individuality, and the wave is only an ego. Okay, and the wave is for you. It's your birth of the body, and when the body is born, there enters a vital into it and a mental into it. Okay, this is the, and when it disappears, you get a new. The soul is the individuality, the true individuality. Again, makes another wave. Okay, you are born again. That's what she is saying. So keep these two images in your mind and we'll read the paragraph. Okay. The wave cannot exist without the sea. That's what he said. Okay. The body-mind life cannot exist without, your body cannot exist without matter. But matter is infinite and your body is finite. The same truth applies to the vitality, the universal plane of prana, energy, okay, Shakti. It is there everywhere. But your individual vital is just a small formation of that. Same thing with the mind also. There's a universal plane of mind, thought power, and that makes a small mind in you, the individual mind. The same is true also of the divine. The divine is infinite, and your individual soul is a small portion of that. So this truth of the sea and the waves comes right from the highest level to the lowest level, from the divine himself, who is infinite and makes finite souls, relatively finite souls, and the body is at the lower level. It is the body which is a small formation of universal matter. Okay. So this is what we are discussing here. Now we discuss the para, but then it will be clear to you. But in the end, we have to see. In the end means when our ignorance ends. But in the end, we have to see that our individualization, what we think is individualization, is only a superficial formation, a small wave on the surface. A practical selection and limited conscious synthesis for the temporary utility of life in a particular body. Now, he's talking about conscious synthesis. Now, what is this synthesis? I think as we go along, it will become clearer. But I think what he means is that there is a synthesis of the matter, life, and mind. Okay, you think it to be one. Okay, a limited practical selection and limited conscious synthesis. It's a conscious synthesis, but it's not unlimited. It is limited. Okay, and limited for what? The temporary utility of life in a particular body. So your individualization, which you think is the individualization, is only useful for one life. In the next life, you will have a different individualization. You will have a different body, different vital, different mind. Or else, it's a constantly changing and developing synthesis pursued through successive lives in successive bodies. So this developing synthesis, the synthesis of your matter, life, and mind is developing and goes on becoming more and more sharp and more clear through many lives. That's what he's saying. So in one life, it's a limited synthesis. But if you consider many lives together, it's a developing synthesis. Okay? And the ultimate synthesis would be right from the highest level, your divine soul, right up to your body. So that would be the developed synthesis. So there is a developing synthesis, there is a limited synthesis in the beginning when we are in ignorance, then through many lives, slowly we are growing, and we is your soul consciousness. Okay? Soul and consciousness, that is developing, and finally it becomes developed. It's a developed synthesis. You realize that you are the divine, but you are also, even matter is also divine. So it becomes a developed synthesis, pursued through successive lives in successive bodies. One by one, your bodies have been born. He is talking only of bodies, but even the vital and the mind also go on changing. But every time there is a small addition. In every life, every time you take a new birth, there is a small addition to the consciousness. It goes on slowly acquiring more and more consciousness, more and more knowledge. Behind it, there is a consciousness, a Purusha, who is not determined or limited by his individualization or by this synthesis or by the contrary, but on the contrary, determines, supports, and yet exceeds it. So again, if you go back to the image either of the glacier or the sea, the deep sea is determining what waves it will put forward. Okay? The wave cannot exist without the sea. And that Purusha that he's talking about is the Purusha. The concept of Purusha is very interesting because the Purusha is the real individual, and at the highest level, the real individual is infinite. But as it keeps coming down, that real individual actually starts limiting himself on purpose. Okay? It becomes on purpose, and finally you have a Purusha at the physical level, you have a Purusha at the vital level, you have a Purusha at the mental level also, and you have a Purusha at the spiritual level, and finally you have a Purusha at the supramental level. The Purusha is there, but at all the levels Purusha is there. We can think of it as consciousness. Okay? And that consciousness is also graded right from the highest to the lowest. Okay? And this Purusha, who is not determined or limited by his individualization, the soul is not determined by the body, mind, life. It is independent. But in the beginning, it is imprisoned, but not determined. Because if it is determined, it would remain constantly subject to body, mind, life. But it need not. It can escape from the limitations of the body, mind, life. Okay? The limited, not determined or limited by his individualization or by the synthesis. The synthesis again, he is talking of the body, mind, life. But on the contrary, determines, supports, and yet exceeds it. The soul is that what, it's very interesting, but the more you become developed, okay, the soul actually decides what body to enter into, what sort of body should I have, what sort of a, it determines it. Because I'll tell you one very interesting thing, mother's body was being prepared before birth by Saraswati, that's what is said. Her body was being prepared in mother's womb. Okay? And because a divine intention was there. Okay? So that's what he's saying here very clearly. He's saying the Purusha determines the individualization. Okay? So that which he selects, he is the Purusha. That which he selects from in order to construct the synthesis of body, mind, life, is his total experience of the world being. The world being is the deep sea. Therefore, our individualization exists by virtue of the world being. It's a universe that determines our body, mind, life. If the universe is not there, there can be no body, mind, life. If the universe is matter, life, and mind, so our individual body, mind, life is made by the universe. So it cannot exist without the universe. But also by virtue of a consciousness which uses the world being for experience of its possibilities of individuality. This what he's saying now, the consciousness which uses the world being, he's talking of the third level. So three levels. The transcendent creates the cosmic, and the cosmic creates the individual. Okay? So that's what he's saying very clearly. But also by virtue of a consciousness which uses the world being for experience. So this consciousness which uses the world being for experience is the third level of its possibilities of individuality. These two powers, person and his world material. The person is the Purusha, the consciousness, the soul, and his world material. Which is the world material? Your body, mind, life. It's a material made by the world. Are both necessary for our present experience of individuality. Both are necessary. The body also is necessary and the soul also is necessary. That's not what the ascetic thinks. The ascetic thinks that the world being is not necessary. In fact, he thinks it is very limited and he rejects it. Okay? So, construct then. So these two powers, person and world material. Here he is talking of world material, but in other places he says person with a P cap and personality with a lowercase. Personality is your body, mind, life. Okay? Keep that in mind. And person with a P cap is your true being, your true soul, or rather your. And I'm using the word soul in a very loose sense because the central being is the psychic and the self, both. Okay? The central being is both. You have a higher true individuality and a lower true individuality. And both are necessary for our present experience of individuality. If the Purusha, with his individualizing synthesis of consciousness, were to disappear, to merge, to annul himself in any way, our constructed individuality would cease because the reality that supported it would no longer be in presence. This is the Buddhistic solution. That's what he's referring to. Look carefully, you will see what he's saying. If the Purusha, if the deep sea did not exist, okay, with his individualizing synthesis, is the Purusha is creating the individual synthesis of body, mind, life. Individualizing synthesis, body, mind, life. Of consciousness were to disappear, that means if the deep sea were not there, there can be no way. To merge, to annul himself in any way, that's what the ascetic is doing. Okay. Our constructed individuality, again different words, constructed individuality, body, mind, life. Because the soul is not constructed, it is eternal, aja, unborn. Constructed individuality, body, mind, life. Okay. Would cease because the reality that supported it would no longer be in presence. If the soul is not there, there can be no body, mind, life. If, on the other hand, the world being were to dissolve, merge, disappear, then also our individualization would cease, or the material of experience by which it affects itself would be wanting. So, in one case, he's saying that if your soul is not there, there can be no body, mind, life. If the world being is not there, the cosmos is not there can be no individual. He is talking of two levels, the individual as well as the cosmos. So, if the Purusha, with his individualized synthesis of consciousness, to disappear, to merge, to annul himself in any way, because annulling himself also there can be many ways. Okay. You can annul the body, mind, life, but you can annul your ego, but you need not annul your true individuality. That's why he's saying in any way. Our constructed individuality, body, mind, life, would cease because the reality that supported it would no longer be in presence. If, on the other hand, now he is going to the cosmos, not the individual, the world being were to dissolve, okay, world being, the cosmos were to dissolve, merge, disappear, then also our individualization would cease. Okay, the body, mind, life would cease. But the material of experience by which it effectuates itself would be wanting. If there is no matter, there can be no body. If there is no universal prana, there can be no vital being. That's what he is saying. If the divine is not there can be no divine soul. We have then to recognize these two terms of our existence, a world being and an individualizing consciousness, which is a cause of all our self-experience and world experience. If the world were not there can be no individual form. The individual form, body, mind, life. But the third level, he is not talking of the third level. Okay? That will come later. So clear what he's saying? I hope so. Let's go on. What's the time?
Yes.
8:35. So we have got 5 minutes more. It's a big para. So I think we stop here today, but we see further that in the end, this Purusha. Now he'll go to the third level. But if there are any questions or not something is not clear, we can discuss it. Otherwise, we'll stop here.
In Mother's prayers and meditations,
Yes.
she has said that an individual has to crystallize. So what exactly does she mean that an individual has to crystallize?
Okay, the word crystallizing is very interesting because what is a crystal? This salt in the water, when the water disappears, the crystal is formed. Crystallization, I think, she's using the word in a very interesting way. Get to the essence. I think she's using in that sense. Okay. The body, mind, life has to slowly disappear, and what remains is the essential part. I think that's what she means. It's a very interesting word that she has used. Okay, crystal. When the salt.
And then.
Yeah, tell me.
And then she says that once you are crystallized, then to offer that crystallized being to the divine is the most difficult thing.
That's right.
Because you think you are the one who's doing everything.
That's right.
So, that means the crystallized being is not open to the psychic being.
I think it means both. The crystallized being would be the psychic being as well as the self. Okay? The central being, the crystal would be the central being. Both, the higher and the lower. The psychic is the lower and the self is the higher. I think she means both. Sometimes you have to use words which are expressive but not very accurate. No words are fully accurate. No? That's the whole problem with language. So crystallization is a very interesting word, very interesting. The unnecessary water disappears and you are left with the essence of things. Okay? So that's what it means. Your body, mind, life is the unnecessary water that disappears and only the psychic being or the self remains. And that has to be offered to the divine. The individual soul has to merge into the universal soul. So they use the word oversoul sometimes. Okay. So shall we stop here today? Okay.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Rangata.
Yeah. Okay. So we have to start from but we see, na? So I'm putting that.
Yes.
Okay. Goodbye, everybody, and have a nice day.